welcome Eugene Tan, Becca D'Bus. And Becca D'Bus, Eugene Tan, is an artist interested in making meaning with entertainment, activism, garments, word, and pleasure. In Singapore, Becca is most known for being the producer and host of RIOT since 2015. Singapore's only regular drag revue, now every Saturday at Hard Rock Cafe, and presented in various format festivals, including the Singapore Night Festival or the Singapore Theatre Festival. Becca D'Bus and her band of outrageous activism informed drag has been seen all over the world since it was created in Boston in 2005. In the space of activism, this is a continuation of works that started for him at his first job out of college at the community engagement theaters of the Theatre Offensive in Boston. In that role, Eugene worked to bring the queer theaters that the company was producing to the peoples that would most need to see it. Underserved queer communities, communities of color, and communities of lower economic means. Also, in that role, Eugene directed a street theater named Desire, a guerrilla-head activist performance troupe performing in parks where men having sex. In Singapore, Eugene has, since 2015, has been part of the organizing committee of Indignation, originally Singapore's Pride season, and is leading its transition to a queer activism-focused organization. They have worked with multiple corporations on their diversity, inclusivity, and equity initiative with various organizations. Please welcome Eugene Tan, Becca D'Bus.
Thank you very much. Hi everybody, how are we all doing? Okay, this is very, very lukewarm, and we're going to try this again. Hi everybody, how are we all doing? Okay, very good. You don't have to be silent with me. I much prefer if you make a lot of noise. So, hi, my name's Becca D'Bus. Thank you for the introduction. That was very, what's the word I'm looking for? Respectable. And I am, very generally speaking, not a very respectable person, especially in Singapore. A space of disrespect is largely what I would call home. So I will start. Let me change that introduction for a second. What you heard earlier is a bio that I write and I offer to organizations when I need to A, impress them, or B, get my foot in the door. My foot's in the door right now. My entire body's in the door right now. If you came here thinking, as some of you maybe, if you know what I do, that I might be taking my clothes off, I'm sorry to disappoint. And I hear the sigh of relief. But what I should really say is this. Hi, my name is Eugene Tan. I am also Becca D'Bus. And really, what I am is a drag queen. What you see behind me is just a whole bunch of flashing images that are meant to keep you vaguely engaged and also slightly distracted from everything else I have to say today. So, hi, how are you? You've heard a little bit about perhaps the kinds of things I've done in my life. That's what you put in a bio. But maybe I should talk about just a couple of things. I understand that this is a business school, and this is Imagination Week, and after this week, we stop imagining. But I should say a few things. First of all, it is true. I am the producer and host of a show called RIOT. Could I just check in with this house? Who here has ever seen a live drag queen, like a drag queen in front of you in person in drag? Okay, so a few, and the rest of you are like, what the hell? And that's okay. I look at myself frequently and think that too. So, hi. What is a drag queen? Does anybody want to try and answer? What is a drag queen? Somebody who's seen one before, and then of course you see it behind me. But anyone? Yes. Hi.
Hi. So maybe my definition is right, but it's a man performing the female genre, and often it's often a woman, and also the types of drag queen, from what I gathered, like there's more beauty queen, fashion queen.
Not me. Okay.
Drag queens and also activists that things that matter, mostly the right approach, and then.
Okay, so I'm just gonna capture a few ideas there, and then we can expand. So I'm hearing from you that there's an idea of like drag queen is a man in women's clothing, something like that, or dressed hyper feminine in some ways. Not wrong. That it's entertaining, perhaps, sometimes beautiful. You're like, I didn't say entertaining, bitch. And that's okay. That's okay. So I'm going to give you a small, just a working definition of what drag is, and then we can expand it from there. Okay. I should also say right now that the language is going to get a little rough. That's just how it is. Here's a working definition of drag. Drag is the heightened performance of gender for purposes of entertainment, in which the performed gender is assumed to be different than the lived gender of the performer. Does that make sense? Is that a lot of words? It is a lot of words. But so I say that because I should say that when I started doing drag in Singapore, so first of all, I didn't start doing drag in Singapore, I started doing drag in Boston. And the thing that I want to note about drag is that drag is actually very much a local form. So while it is practiced all over the world, there is not really a global version of drag. I don't care what RuPaul's Drag Race is going to try and tell you. Drag, as you see it on TV, is going to be different than drag as you see it in a local context. Drag in Singapore is different than drag in KL. Drag in Thailand is definitely different than drag in Singapore. And if you go to the US, who here has watched RuPaul's Drag Race? You can admit it, it's terrible entertainment, but it's okay. Even if you watch RuPaul's Drag Race, you will realize that drag in different parts of the US are actually different. They come from different places, they address different concerns, and it's important to talk about drag being local, because when I moved back to Singapore and I was trying to start doing drag again, because I'd taken a little break to do some corporate work. I was working in marketing at Longchamp. I was an editor of a magazine. When I started wanting to start a career again, it became very, very clear to me that the way drag was done in Singapore in 2015, I was never going to get hired by anybody. Because drag in Singapore at the time was very hyper-feminine. It was very interested in beauty and grace, neither of which I have. And it was very interested in this idea of performers performing on stage together. So the idea of like a group number, like three people together, and so on and so forth. And when you have three people together, and two of them are hyper-feminine and one looks like a fat clown, that's not a show. That's like a random accumulation of people. So in 2014, I was 36 years old and aware that I was going to turn 37 very shortly. I made a decision that I was not that far. I was 36. 50 wasn't too far away in my mind. And at 50, I imagined that my entire face would collapse and I would never be able to put on makeup again. And so I decided that if I want to have a career in drag, I had to go full time. So at the end of 2014, I quit my job, and then I was like, in 2015, I'm going to make it work. 2 days after that, I hadn't told anybody, I got hired for my first professional gig ever as a full-time performer. And that gig was to perform with 21 other people in a 6-hour-long performance installation that would open the Singapore in France Festival at the Palais de Tokyo in April of that year. I saw this as a good sign, and I saw this as encouragement that my life was going to work out. Didn't quite work out that way. But when we did that project, so that project was called The Incredible Adventures of Border Crossers. We opened at, as I said, the Singapore and France Festival, but then ultimately it moved back to Singapore, to the Singapore International Festival of Arts, where we did the show at the National Museum. I say this because throughout my career, I have realized that my practice of drag has always been this kind of weird dance between high culture, between good taste, shall we say, and things that are a lot more base, things that are really about just pleasure and entertainment and sex and naughtiness and crudeness, and this play back and forth is actually, for me, the extremely productive space in terms of making meaning. Again, I just used a lot of words that actually, if you use these words in the space of drag, people will look at you like you're crazy. The other thing that I should say to you now about drag is that, about my career, is that in 2015, I knew that I had to make my own show. And I opened that show in 2015 on Valentine's Day, because single. And I probably have the distinction of being the only drag performer in Singapore to have opened a show in a club, and on the day that we opened, I was on the front cover of a national paper. On the lifestyle section, true, but still on the front cover. Taking up the entire front cover was a drag queen. I wish I could... I should say this is not an achievement on my part. We should be clapping for that local paper because, but they're not in print anymore. But anyway, it's not my fault. It's not my fault. It's just the death of print. But I say that because when I started when I started doing the show, it was called RIOT. It still is called RIOT. It had a very distinct, shall we say, response from two different fields. Among drag queens, a lot of them would look at what we were doing and think like, why is this extremely trashy, kind of unpolished, kind of messy drag queen, why is she getting all these opportunities? And then there was also an audience of people who are kind of outside of drag who would look at what I was doing and be like, oh my God, you're elevating the form because you can speak in full English sentences, because you can say things that sound vaguely like you've thought about what drag is. And that's kind of exactly where we were at, right? We could be in this place where both of these things were true, but this also pointed out to me a truth that was said to me about my performances when I was living in Boston. So I worked in a queer theater company. My boss, the artistic director of the company, his name's Abe Ryback. I once asked him, because Abe used to be a drag performer himself, I said one day over lunch, I was like, can I buy you lunch and then you can tell me about my drag and we can indulge me for a little bit? And he said, sure. And he said to me once something that has always stuck with me, and he said, the thing about your drag is ultimately, I think that your drag is about how judgment is pathetic. Which at the time felt really deep. It still does. But what I think he meant was this. When you look at me, I don't know what your name is, but hi, how are you? When you look at me, you are allowed to judge me, absolutely, because it's something that we all do. It's like, I can't stop you from doing whatever you want to do, right? Like, you can look at me and you can judge me as much as you want. And the function that my drag seems to be able to do in this room is to say, yes, you can do that, but in this moment, that's all pathetic. And it all doesn't matter. And while you can hold on to that judgment as much as you want, you will also be made to feel that that judgment in that moment doesn't have a lot of value. And the fact that you're hanging on to this thing that doesn't have a lot of value might be a little bit pathetic. And I say this because I think very often people look at what we do, and it is, it's extravagant, it's silly, it's all these things, and a fair question is what for? Why do this thing you call drag? And the obvious sassy answer is why not? But actually, for me, the answer is because. And because is good enough. Because freedom is good enough. Because being able to throw these ideas out, such as what is a man versus a woman, actually, as a way of organizing society, yes, there is gender, but I'm sure, as you know by now, that actually the world's a little bit more complicated than there being two genders. Or perhaps, if you want to include trans folk and say that that's a third gender, to say that there's three genders, it's still actually a little bit more complicated than that. And there's a way in which drag is able to say, yes, there is a men's toilet and a women's toilet, yes, but when you look at a drag queen and you have to ask yourself a very simple question, like which toilet she's supposed to use, which I have to tell you, in drag is a real question for people sometimes, you start to realize how these things are just, not that useful, right? Is that classy? Is it elegant, or is that trashy? Not that useful, frankly. Right now, it's just entertaining, and that's okay, right? Is she like, is she beautiful, or is she disgusting? She's disgustingly beautiful, and that's fine too, right? So I say all that because, as I was saying, my career has been about, is it high culture or is it low culture? Is it art or is it entertainment is actually how it gets framed a lot. And what I have come to realize is that this conversation is quite old, right? High culture versus low culture, which has more value. And actually the answer to that is it doesn't matter. Because it's going to matter to you how it matters to you, right? Like what you see in front of you is going to matter to you how it's going to matter to you. I want to say that because drag comes from a space of queerness, obviously, it also comes from a space of the working class. And by this I mean, there is not a school that somebody goes to for drag. You don't get a master's in drag performance, right? There are drag performers with MFAs and that sort of thing, but that education is not an education in drag, right? And I say that, and because of this very simple thing, and because we come from a place of queerness, very often we find ourselves having to justify our drag, right? So very often we have to answer the question why. We have to answer the question like why it's valuable, why should I pay for this, why does it matter, why does it take up space? And I feel like we've come from there to three things that people repeat all the time as a means of justifying the form, right? So the first, I think, those of you who are familiar with RuPaul's Drag Race will probably have heard this sentence before. We're all born naked and the rest is drag. This is why you shouldn't hate us. We're all just humans, right? So you in a white shirt right now, you're in drag. I'm in a red dress right now, I'm in drag. On the screen, that's another version of drag. And I'm here to say that I don't think that's true. I think drag is a bit more specific than that. So the working definition I gave earlier, I think it's actually a little bit too loose, but even that's more specific than we're all born naked and the rest is drag. We're not fundamentally the same. I keep looking at you because you're right in front of me, but any of you, I suspect, don't probably get a kick out of the idea that you might get away with just duct tape on your tits. I do. I get really excited by this idea, not like sexually excited, but I get really excited by the idea of how little can I get away with doing, or how ridiculous can I look on a daily basis when I'm in drag and when I'm out of drag. We're fundamentally wired a little bit differently, I suspect. The other thing that people say all the time as a way of justifying it is to say that drag is an art form and therefore worthy of respect. Right? That drag queens are artists, and therefore you should respect us. And I think that comes from a place of wanting to justify what we do, but it also comes from a place of wanting to, that I think doesn't fully understand what is happening in drag. So in drag, I think, if I were to ask you, what is the art form of drag, or if you were to ask me, I actually can't answer that question. Because actually, a drag performer is tapping into multiple performance and art forms at any one time. There is not a singular drag form. It's not like saying acting or dance, which are art forms, right, or painting. If I said to you, what's a painting, you kind of have an image of what a painting is. What is drag? It can look like very many different things. But what I've realized is actually drag is a culture. And what that means is it isn't just us putting on makeup and putting on costumes and all the rest of that. It isn't just us looking beautiful or trashy or hideous or sexy or any of these things. It is the context and the world that we are creating in that process. It is what you are deciding to give up when you come and enter and see a show. It is what we as performers believe in when we perform. And some people in drag aren't even quote unquote performing. There are drag queens who literally get paid to show up and walk around and look cute. I've done that kind of work. It's the best kind of work. But so. I just want to put that out there because also I think the idea of not recognizing drag as a culture also means that it leads to this idea that anybody can do drag. So all you have to do is put on the wig and put on the makeup. So you have this idea that if I can put in enough money into it, put enough resources into it, then we're all doing it, and that's kind of not what's really happening. I should just say that. And the last thing that I think has been said a lot to sort of justify drag, and it's been used with me as well, is that drag is potentially a business, right? That you can make money off of it. So there's like RuPaul's Drag Race just won an Emmy Award, for example, which isn't a business thing, but anyway. Or that RIOT exists as a show, and therefore drag is valid, but actually drag is just valid. Actually, the money piece of it is just a way for people outside of drag to sort of frame what we're doing and to sort of measure a kind of value, and I have to say, it's a value that I fundamentally reject. I understand that some of you have been in a class and we've been talking about problems and solutions, right? How do you frame a problem? What is your problem statement, et cetera, et cetera. And I guess what I'm trying to say, I sound a little bit like a drag evangelist, but I'll say this much. For me, drag isn't, drag is neither the problem nor the solution. Drag just is, and just being is enough. And that's what I'd like to leave you with. But I'm not leaving. I understand that there are two of you who've been tasked to ask me some questions. I don't know where you are, but can I invite you to join me on stage? Now's a good time. Come on, don't be afraid. Can you all clap for them, please?
One of the questions we had was mainly about how do you maintain boundaries in your profession, because it relates kind of with sex work. And, well, in a way. So how do you maintain an image that is close to more an art performance than a sex performance for people that wouldn't know so much about drag?
If I'm just going to repeat the question because I'll be sure I understand it. So the question is that there is a kind of overlap between drag and sex work. I agree, there is. And how do you maintain a boundary between, sex work, say, and performance? The short answer is I don't. I'm not personally a sex worker. I don't have the personality for it, to be perfectly honest. I admire people who do. I used to work, a lot of people I work with are sex workers, in fact. But I think there's a thing that happens in drag that people are forgetting when you ask that question, and that is people are fundamentally afraid of drag queens. So for instance, if I were to rush you right now, you will back off. Right? If I were to invite any one of you, as I think there's a photo of me doing that right now. If I were to invite one of you on stage right now, take your shoe off and lick your foot, you wouldn't dare hit me. Because I've already told you that because I've already demonstrated to you that whatever you think you want to do, I'll go a step further. So I don't think of it so much as a boundary, as much as it establishes a kind of hierarchy in the room, which I think is a thing that people get quite scared of with drag queens, or drag performers, is that we're a little bit unpredictable and it seems like we'll do anything and correct on both fronts.
Good. Thank you very much. Our teacher explains to us in our class the 377A law that just passed in Singapore. So
it just got repealed, it didn't just pass.
Yeah, okay, yeah, sorry. So maybe you can explain this event again, and I wanted to know what was the sentiment in your community regarding this event.
So 377A is a colonial era law that outlawed sex between two consenting adult men. It's currently 2024. It was finally repealed in Singapore in 2023 after many, many years of activism from various groups of activists. I think if we want to describe sentiment around it, it's a complicated question because it depends very much on who you ask. It depends very much on how they were involved in the fight against, the fight to repeal 377A. And it also depends on how people understand queer or gay activism. So there's a lot of layers to that. I would say that among men who sort of came of age at a time when things were a lot more restrictive in Singapore, then obviously, it's a celebrated thing because, obviously we've been fighting for it for a long time. I say them as if I'm not one of them, but I am, right? Among some of our younger activists in Singapore, I've noticed a kind of feeling that the repeal of 377A was a kind of way of sort of taking the wind out of sails of activists, because what happened was that the law was repealed, but actually, whether or not you're going to outlaw sex between men are still gonna fuck, right? Like, we all know this. But actually, the impact of the law is around all the other parts of life that have to do with who you establish partnerships with and who you have sex with. So, for instance, the way it impacts education might be in the realm of sex education in schools. So if you are in a government school in Singapore, the sex education you get around around gay sex specifically is either don't do it, or it used to be you're a criminal and you might die. And that hasn't changed that much since then. Housing policy hasn't changed since then. And in the repeal of 377A, there was a kind of assurance from the government that these things won't change. So it's a pretty mixed bag about how people respond to it.
Thank you.
The thing with 377A that was highlighted by our teacher was that then, yes, the law was repealed, but just after in the Constitution, it was written that gay marriage will never be recognized, and that's really the issue that was raised.
So I think, I think that might be an oversimplification. So essentially, if I understood it correctly, what happened was that marriage, what was written in the Constitution was that marriage would be defined by something called the Women's Charter. It doesn't actually say in the Constitution that marriage will always be defined as male-female or man-woman. Actually, male-female in Singapore, in the Singaporean context. I should also say that as a queer activist, I'm not precisely interested in queer marriage. I do think that marriage as a way of organizing society is extremely limited, and I think queer people can be people who are leading the way in us reconsidering that as an idea.
Well, the thing is, by being married, you get benefits, tax benefits.
This is precisely my point. Why do we not get benefits anyway, whether I'm married or not? You know what I mean? Like, if I have a child, I should be able to have benefits and rights for that child, whether I'm married or not. Whether or not I'm loving in a way that has to do with two people shouldn't define whether or not I get public housing. You know what I mean? So that's what I'm getting at.
Okay. And we had another question about why you chose Singapore to exercise your profession, to do your shows, because you're a Singaporean activist. Why especially this place?
I didn't have a choice. So I used to live in Boston. I worked in a queer theater company. That's how I had a visa to be there. 2008 happened. There was a financial crisis. If you worked in the nonprofit sector, you weren't really affected by a financial crisis till 2010, when all your grants dried up. So in my case, for instance, about $80,000 in grant funding dried up. One of our grantors went from an endowment of multiple millions of dollars to zero because of Bernie Madoff, et cetera. So essentially, I got laid off, and then I didn't have a visa, so I had to move back to Singapore. And then once I was in Singapore, once it became clear that I was moving back to Singapore, it just was clear to me that I wasn't going to be able to it speaks to my personality more than anything else. I wasn't going to be able to make Singapore work if I didn't just commit to it. So for a while, I just told myself, you're not allowed to think about moving away. You just have to make it work. And then, you sink roots when you do that.
And we also wanted to know just how did you discover drag and how did you find your talent in it?
Talent is such a strong word. How did I discover drag? Is that the question? Or drag for myself?
Drag for yourself, I think.
Right, so I went to university and I went to college and studied marketing, communications, and theater studies, which is, kind of whatever thing to do. I thought when I left college that I was going to be a performance artist in the very stereotypical vision of what performance artists look like, like people who sit in galleries and like crack eggs on their heads. I thought that was my life. And then, when I started working the Theatre Offensive, I worked on a street theater named Desire, and part of doing that work, because it is safer sex education work, right? We were talking about, as Abe, my boss, used to say to our funders, a street theater named Desire makes performances about HIV transmission 10 feet from actual HIV transmission, because we would go to a public park where literally men are fucking, and we would do shows about sex there. Right? And we would do shows about, sexually transmitted diseases, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's a public health project. But in order to do that work, we had to also learn how to talk about safer sex in various queer spaces. And so we were assigned to work in gay clubs where nobody wanted to talk to us because, imagine for a second, you're out at a club, you're trying to hook up with the next person, and along comes some random stranger going like, "Hello, can we talk about your risks?" It's like, what the hell? And so my outreach partner and I attempted to put on some drag one night and see if people would talk to us, and then we became really successful at it. The numbers we were reporting were high enough that we were investigated for fraud. And that kind of stuck, and then I entered an amateur contest, and I just kept doing it.
Thank you.
Well, we didn't plan other questions because we wanted to keep also target.
We're gonna open the floor to the rest of the
audience. You moderate. Go for it.
Does anyone want to ask question? Anyone in the room?
No, if you do that, nobody will do that. So you have to be engaged a bit more for that.
Yes.
Who wants to ask a question?
If nobody
to you, Mehdi? To Mehdi?
No,
So we can open to the audience who wants to ask a question.
You
yes,
can ask. Yes.
Oh, she's run. So thank you for your speech. It was very interesting, and I'm trying to find the words for my question. But how does it work being a drag performer in Singapore? Like, is it really? Obviously, it's different from Boston. But you started in 2015, so did you feel the law, something like that?
Did I feel something?
Feel the law, the show was completely legal. I don't know.
Oh, okay.
I'm asking
So I think I should say a few things. There is a very deep history of drag in Singapore. You may have heard of something called Bugis Street. You may have heard of a club called Boom Boom Room, which was a drag cabaret that existed when I was in my teens. So it's always existed. I think the proposition of RIOT was that it was going to be ticketed and it was going to insist on being a show in entirety that you came to and saw and that sort of thing. In terms of licensing something like this, actually, it's possible. The show doesn't run illegally. We run in venue. So, RIOT, in the version that if you came to the show, you would see now, runs in a venue that has what's called an entertainment license. So it's a place that serves food and beverage and is allowed to present entertainment that has an age limit on it, 18 plus in our case. And if the venue is willing to say that we are part of their regular programming, then we're all good to go. During the pandemic, because these venues could not be open because food and beverage, we started doing the show in the projector on a much smaller scale. And at that time, we also had to get the show license, so we would submit for what's called an arts entertainment license. It takes 2 months. You have to submit all the lyrics in your show 2 months before the show. If you think that's funny, just understand that drag queens very frequently don't decide what we're doing till like 2 hours before the show. So yeah, we went through a really weird process with that, but we were always licensed. And actually the thing that was surprising for me was that sometimes we would get, depending on the lyrics of the show, we would get a license that was like lower rated than 18 plus. So sometimes they would say 16 plus is fine, and I would be like, can I just say 18 plus because I don't like children? And they'd be like, yeah, that's fine.
Okay, thank you.
Someone else?
Somebody else. Yes. Oh, in the back. Run.
Hello. So what events in your life led you to choose this career path? Like,
Do you mean like, was I hugged by my parents? What do you mean?
I don't know, like, anyone, like I've heard people who usually go in the entertainment path somehow linked to their childhood and or their family.
Yeah, so you really mean was I hugged by my parents? I was. I don't know. For me, drag, I've always found it to be colorful, and I'm attracted to colorful things. I'm attracted to outrageous things. When I think about my interests outside of drag, it has a lot to do with beauty, queerness, sex, things like that, drag became, drag is just a space in which those things come together, if that makes sense. I'm not sure that I can trace my interest in drag to childhood. I did, however, find, weird aside, I've never been a singer, so if you want to be in entertainment and you have no musical sense at all, lip sync is wonderful. Yeah.
Thank you.
I did just say, right, talent is a very strong word. There's a question over there.
There's a
Here.
question over, yeah.
Tamara, anybody?
Very quickly. So my question is, we've been having a lot of conversations around identity in my room, and so I know that a lot of the performers craft identities. Can you talk to us a little bit about how you crafted Becca D'Bus and what the thought process was in coming up with your stage presence?
So I'm gonna make a confession. I'm a very lazy performer. And by that I mean there are drag performers who've really, really done the work of like, this is Eugene and Becca is this, and there's a backstory and da 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 da. Becca is just Eugene in very colorful things that would otherwise be too uncomfortable to wear on a daily basis. I like to say that Becca is just me, but more colorful, louder, a bit braver. So in my case, that's all there is to it. The name comes from specifically American civil rights history. So I knew when I was trying to find a name for myself. So when I started, I was very insistent that my drag name was Eugene, and I thought it was very edgy. And people found it just very confusing. So I knew that if I was going to find a drag name, I wanted it to have a little bit of political bite, and I knew that I wanted it to be punny. And so I had landed on two options. One was Becca D'Bus, and the other was civil disobedience. And I had a very good friend who said, I can promise you there are at least 7 civil disobediences. And so I landed on Becca D'Bus. Is anyone in this room American or familiar with the history? Yes, so you know what Becca D'Bus refers to, yes or no? Yeah. For the rest of you, Google Rosa Parks, that's all I'm going to say. Yes?
My question is, in Singapore, what does activists can do, and how can they be politically represented?
What can activists do? You mean as activism? Yeah.
As drag activism.
Yeah, I'm fascinated by the term drag activist. I'm not sure what that means, but I'll take it. So I think that when we think about activism with regards to queerness, there are probably 3 ways in which this happens. There is the idea of community building, right? So there's the idea of us finding our own people, and that can be powerful for any marginalized group. There is the idea of us advocating, so literally speaking to government. And then there is and I guess the third function is a kind of direct service kind of thing. So if we think about the queer activist landscape in Singapore, there are groups such as Indignation that are largely focused on talking among queer people, about building, about educating among queer people, about making space among queer people, about finding ways for queer people to find each other and to imagine or discover what their views on anything might be, right? If we're talking about talking directly to the government, there are organizations such as Ready for Repeal, such as Pink Dot, that are actively lobbying the government or are working through the court system or however one does that, right? And then the third thread of this is in direct service. So an organization like Uga Chaga, which offers counseling and mental health services specifically for queer folk. Something like the Tea Project, which is a homeless shelter for trans people, and the only homeless shelter in Singapore that accepts trans folk. Or Project X, which works directly with sex workers. And obviously organizations don't do only one of these things. People, it sort of overlaps and it flows into each other.
Thank you. Maybe the last question.
One more question.
Yes,
Make
yes.
it good.
Just here.
No pressure.
Oh, wow, okay. Actually, my question isn't deep at all. It's more like practical. How long does it take to go, sorry if the words are not correct, but how long does it take to go from Eugene to Becca? And do you get ready by yourself? Do you have a team? How did you learn to the makeup, the hair, everything?
So the answer to the question is it depends. If I'm running late, as I often do, if I'm running late, I can get my entire face on in 20 minutes. People who know me very well know exactly when that happens because it's like I don't know how many people in this room wear makeup on a regular basis, but I'll just say what I'll say next, and then if it's baffling to you, whatever. It's a really basic smoky eye, if that makes sense. It's just a lot of color. And then if I just want to, as we say in drag, feel the fantasy and put on my makeup and then stare at myself and be experimental, I can be spending 3 hours in front of the mirror, 4 hours if I wanted to. I am too damn broke to have a team of people around me, so it's just me. We occasionally have assistants, especially on photo shoots, but that's really just because you can't see yourself in a photo shoot, right? It's purely practical. But yeah, I make everything you see me wear, including right now. I didn't make my shoes, but everything else you're seeing, I made.
Thank you.
Is that the last question?
Thank you, Eugene.
Does anybody have one more deep question? Yep. You, sir. Hi, how are you? Mike's coming to you. Yes, just let a woman run to you. Why don't you? This is misogyny.
Hello. Thank you for coming here.
Thanks. Thanks for having me.
I have a question, because you said that you were not performing in front of children, I've heard, only 18 plus.
I don't particularly enjoy being around children.
Okay. When you said that, it reminded me of something happening in France. Several shows from drag queen were cancelled in cities. So little RIOT happened because some parents were not happy that drag queen shows could happen in front of children. It was something like 3 years old and above. And also those shows were receiving money from the cities. That's why they were not happy. I wanted to know, what do you think about those events in France? And what do you think about drag queen performing in front of children 3 years old or more? Thank you.
So I will start the answer to that question in, it's slightly roundabout, but bear with me. If we come back to what I had said earlier about how I define drag, if we think of drag as a heightened performance of gender for the purposes of entertainment, I would then have to say to you that Ariana Grande, kind of drag. Madonna, kind of drag. Granted, you don't generally put Madonna in front of children. Elvis Presley, kind of drag. Ronald McDonald, kind of drag. So on and so forth, right? I think there's a fundamental idea at the basis of this, of saying that drag and children don't belong together, where we make an assumption that all drag performers perform in the same way. And we also make an assumption that just because we didn't go to school to do this, we don't actually know what the fuck we're doing. So if I'm going to be performing for a group of people, myself, I'll use myself as an example. If I'm performing for a group of people who've never seen a drag queen in their life, then what I do in front of that audience is going to be very different than if I was performing for a group of people who spend a lot of their time just consuming drag, for a start, right? So what I do is fundamentally going to be different, and it's going to be different not because I care about the sensitivities of the people around me. It's different because what is entertaining in that moment is actually always going to be about this interaction. So what I do in front of a person is always going to have to be in some way relevant to that audience, right? So I don't actually know the French example, but I have to imagine that if you're a drag performer and you're performing for a 3-year-old, you're not really doing crazy amounts of hypersexual work. You're not doing crazy amounts of like really tough political humor, because the 3-year-old isn't gonna get it, right? Just as if I were to like take my top off in front of a 3-year-old, what are they gonna do? Breastfeed? No. you know what I mean? So I think that's the first thing I should say. I should also say that I think we tend to forget in these conversations that actually a lot of children's entertainment plays in a space of gender play. Like that's just a reality. So for instance, little girls wanting to be princesses, I can promise you most little girls are not royal. That's just, you know, that's real. And most little girls do not live existences that are hyper feminine in that same way. The reason that we don't look at that and think of that as gender play is that we understand gender very narrowly. There's man, there's woman. We don't understand that there's woman, there's hyper feminine, there's extremely hyper feminine, and then there's like all these other, you know, all these other ways in which that happens. This is in part what I mean by this understanding, this that when we organize society by gender, it's a little bit fucked up. It's very insufficient, if you will. So that's what I would say. I mean, I'm assuming in the French example that we're not talking about actual predators performing with children. I'm assuming that, right?
All right. Thank you. Thank you very much, Eugene. Thank you so much for being with us this afternoon.